All right, so we've established the fact that the world is not really becoming homogenized. That globalization does not mean that everybody settles on some similar kind of cultural expression. But what is actually happening? Well, anthropologists are divided on this topic, but there are two kinds of outgrowths that both seem viable. One of those is something called cultural convergence, where each culture maintains its traditional practices, but they change a bit. They develop to um, really kind of move towards a mean expression of the differences between those two cultures. And the second is hybridization, where those two cultures that have come into contact then exchange features and result in a kind of third, unspecified, unpredicted perhaps, mishmash of the two. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. Ernest Geller suggested that local traditions gradually fade as Western ideas replace those in non-Western communities. And so he calls this the McDonaldization model. What this focuses on is efficiency, calculability, predictability, tight control over production, and mechanized labor over human labor. These are characteristics of fast food restaurants and really at its core, American society. These are increasingly becoming characteristics of the world. And another term that's been used as a reflection of this cultural convergence idea is the coca colonization, or the westernization or Americanization of cultures. This is how culturally and economically powerful Western nations, specifically the United States, but also some parts of Western Europe, Japan, and Australia, impose their products and beliefs on the rest of the world. We also call this cultural imperialism. And what this does is changes the culture that is being displaced until it becomes more similar to the culture of the economic superpower. So I can speak to this to some degree in China when we were in Beijing and Shanghai. Beijing felt like, I don't know, DC, but with more martial law, perhaps. Whereas Shanghai felt more like New York City. Shanghai was definitely more multi ethnic, but both places you saw the preponderance of American companies, right? You've got companies like Gap and Coach and such doing production in these areas. You've got restaurants like, surprisingly, KFC was very, very popular in the areas of China where we were. That McDonald's, Burger King, etc. You've got even fast food chain Chinese restaurants like Panda Express and such, which was really, really weird to think that you would travel to China and go eat at a Panda Express instead of some of the glorious street food that's available. But that's just my perspective. Some people like that predictability. The same thing is true in parts of Europe where you've got local cafes with really wonderful cappuccinos and such, and then you've got Starbucks where you always know what you're going to get. And so what happens is you take two unique cultures or more, and they combine to form this world culture. This world culture would include things like shared foods, entertainment, and clothing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the cultures are homogenous. So there can be other aspects: political style, educational system, religion is a big one that can remain distinct, that can still carry attributes of um, the unique culture that it came from, while many of the consumer consumption things, like the foods, like the entertainment, like the clothing, have kind of combined into this world cultural expression. So, one major limitation then of convergence theories is that they equate material goods with cultural and personal identity. And yeah, there's some aspect of this. I mean, my work with high school students definitely shows an equating of material goods, iPhones, Instagram, Snapchat, etc., with uh, their own personal identity. But I don't think that's really true as people kind of age out of the conformity and the striving to fit in that they experienced during like middle school and high school. So by contrast, hybridization emphasizes a world based on cultural mixing. So this is where you focus on things like border crossings, persistent cultural diversity, that you end up with this hybrid culture that contains some aspects of each parent culture. Some critics of hybridization theory argue that cultural mixing is superficial, that the reality is that these cultures are actually converging on a common world culture. Others suggest that this theory ignores political power, economic power, and inequality. So just because you've got some words that you adopt, or just because you've got some foods that you exchange, that doesn't equate with each of the parent cultures having like the same footing in terms of political influence or economic power, right? And that doesn't negate then the inequality between the dominant culture and the subordinate culture. There's still other anthropologists that assert that any of these theories that they don't need to be mutually exclusive. There can be aspects of convergence, there can be aspects of hybridization. Both of these can occur within the same situation of cultural contact. So both can be in multiple places at the same time, and that really what's happening is some sort of mix of the two. So can you identify any examples of cultural hybridization in your community? Think about New Mexico. Think about Albuquerque if you're local, or other areas of New Mexico if you're not. Think about your own cultural heritage. How does the example that you came up with connect these transnational dynamics and processes? So, really give some reflection. I mean, what has changed about food, for example, as American culture and Spanish Mexican culture came together? What has changed about style of dress? What has changed about dominant economic activities? All right, so how then do we study these global interconnections? Anthropologists conduct fieldwork, right? Oftentimes at a single location. So how can we study a local phenomenon in a community without losing sight of international forces that shape that community? How do we do kind of this new era of ethnography? Well, one solution is multi-sited ethnography. Multi-sited research is where you study the same phenomenon in multiple locations. So it's becoming a common anthropological research strategy for things like environmental issues, the media, international religious movements, the spread of science and technology. So you study both the sources and you study the people adopting those patterns. And you're really looking at what's called the global diaspora, right? How a culture has spread throughout the world. And religion is a really good example of this, right? We could even just look within Christianity, and we pick Christianity because, having grown up Southern Baptist, that's what I'm most familiar with. But look at how Christianity is practiced in Western Europe, in the U.S., and on through Africa and Asia, right? I mean, we can just look at the U.S. and think about Latter-day Saints and this belief that Jesus appeared to Joseph Smith, right, and brought him additional information that resulted in the Book of Mormon. So we could look at how Christianity has changed as it's become incorporated in other populations, other kind of styles of religious practice. So can you identify any practical difficulties or ethical dilemmas that must be involved in multi-sited research? These might be different from traditional ethnographic research in a single community setting. I will tell you, sometimes there's some legal issues, things that you can study in some populations you can't in others. There are cultures that won't let unrelated men be in the presence or at least be with women alone, right? When we talk about some of these cultures that practice what we call female claustration with veiling or seclusion, if you're a male anthropologist, you may simply not be allowed access to these females, right? So that's one example. Sometimes you've got corporate interests that won't let you study what you really want to study. So when we think about that spirit possession of Malaysian workers, right? Much of the industry that's being done in Malaysia is the production of computer chips like Intel and such. Sometimes you're going to have issues from the corporation itself that they're happy to let you talk to American workers who are going to present a very different view of that corporation than workers at some of their manufacturing sites. All right, so that brings us then to the environment, okay? As an aspect of globalization, there's a clash between conservationists and indigenous populations as well. Okay, so most of what we talked about with respect to globalization is economic, sometimes social or political, but we've got to recognize that there's an effect on our planet as a whole as well, right? One of the reasons why multinational corporations have moved their manufacturing to the periphery, to the less developed countries, is because there are looser environmental restrictions. So they can kind of, quote unquote, get away with more. So we've got to recognize that cultures have different approaches to nature. And this is, in essence, the focus of environmental anthropology. Environmental anthropologists are interested in exploring the effects of environmental changes globally within societies both large and small and cross-culturally. So studying the environmental beliefs, knowledge, and practices of small-scale societies has always been a part of anthropology, right? This is one of the things, I mean, from really its inception, I think to Napoleon Chagnon as an example of this. Napoleon Chagnon worked with a group called the Yanomamo in Brazil. The Yanomamo are horticulturalists who also engage in some hunting to have access to protein. So, these garden kind of societies. And he, one of the things that's notable about the Yanomamo is that at least at first sight, they appear to be really, really aggressive. There's a lot of endemic raiding, a lot of warfare between villages. And so early on in Chagnon's work, he termed them the noble savage. The idea that there's a savagery that's present, perhaps in the way that they interact with one another, in some of their cultural traditions, etc., but that they are also somehow noble and conservationists, right? And this idea has been hard for anthropology to shake. A lot of the early Western anthropologists really went into these indigenous populations with this paternalistic colonial kind of framework where they were going to study what the population was like, even just to see whether they were candidates for civilizing, whether they were candidates then for exploitation, etc. And so, you end up, a lot of hunter-gatherer groups have been viewed as somehow conservationist at heart. Okay, the Kung, the Hoitzan of South Africa, are an example of that. Right, while they were living as nomadic hunter-gatherers, their stewardship really was helping local wildlife populations. So a lot of people thought, well, they're inherently conservationists. Once they were settled into reservations, guess what? Well, because they weren't able to range across the 25,000 square kilometers that they used to range, they started to hunt local populations to extinction because they were forced by the government to stay in this really isolated, small area, small reservation. So there isn't something inherent in hunter-gatherers' psychology that makes them conservationist at heart, right? It's just that their movements are done in response to changing population density of prey items and seasonality of vegetable items and such. So when they're at low population densities and they're able to range across their traditional homelands, you don't end up hunting animals to extinction. All right, so do all people see nature in the same way? No. There's no way that the answer to that could be yes, right? We have different perspectives of nature. And people conceive nature and their relation to it very differently in ways that are reflected in other aspects of culture. So we can look at the indigenous people of southern Mexico and Central America and the Spanish when they arrived in the 1500s. Some natives were able to avoid the invaders by retreating into the tropical lowlands. The Spaniards didn't like that kind of environment. They found it oppressive. They wondered why the forest wasn't simply cleared. This is really what's at the root of many of these indigenous populations that are still alive in the Brazilian Amazon, even though they're threatened right now. So, the fact that colonialists didn't really want to follow these people into these remote locations. This reflects a different worldview that where indigenous populations saw themselves as part of nature, Spanish populations saw themselves as dominant over nature. So similarly, the Itzaj Maya of Guatemala view people and nature as belonging to the same realm. Forest spirits then punish those who cut down too many trees or overhunt, and reward those that show restraint. So we have an intertwining of religion with how nature is viewed. We can look at New Mexico, Puebloans, and see this too. There's a different kind of quote unquote respect for nature or relationship with Mother Earth, with the gifts that she gives among native populations here in New Mexico and among those that are more Hispanic or Anglo. So we've got a human nature divide. Westerners are typically identify with dominion over nature, but Western thinking has not always separated humans from everything else. We've got St. Francis of Assisi, right? Put other animals more or less on the same plane as humans. That's why he's the patron saint of animals. We've also got a detachment between people and nature that's evident in the term of natural resources. So nature then is a collection of materials for humans to possess, control, exploit, and manage. We've seen a rift between what might be termed liberal or left-leaning conservationists and hunters. I'm recording this up at our cabin in northern New Mexico, and one of the great things about this is that we're out in the middle of nowhere, and we've got elk herds that come through, and we've got hunters who rent our cabin every year for the elk hunts. Right? I'm typically a bleeding heart conservationist, right? I want animal populations to be protected, particularly at this exchange or border between animals and humans. I feel like we have overexploited a lot of populations, but hunters are also conservationists. How can you be a conservationist if you selectively cull the herd? Well, it's because for a lot of the animals that are hunted, I think about the white-tailed deer back east. If they weren't hunted, towns would be overwhelmed with them because they're able to exist quite successfully with suburban grass yards, lawns filled with grass. So these don't have to be at odds. That even if we exploit nature in the sense of hunting, right, we can still do so with good wildlife and natural management processes. In the 1500s, Sir Francis Bacon argued that nature should be harnessed to make the world a better place for human. That is clearly dominion over nature. Herodotus, in 484 to 425 BC, argued that biophysical factors shape human events and societies. So, for example, when talking about the Scythians, he talked about their warlike nature that was akin to their barren desert environment, so that even populations that were encountered would have characteristics, cultural characteristics, personality characteristics that were like the environment that they inhabited. So desert people were often viewed as hot-headed, both literally and figuratively, right? Part of that is because desert people were often pastoralists, and with that came the inherent threat of warfare, because you can take cattle away from a population, right? You can steal cattle quite easily. You can't do the same kind of thing with land. So this is an early form of what we call environmental determinism. Later, Marvin Harris argued that social customs do develop in response to ecological conditions. Critics of this argue that ecosystems impact culture, but that humans also shape their ecosystems. And that is true. Natural systems are certainly based on the interaction of non-living factors and living species. One of the reasons why agriculture took hold roughly 12,000 years ago was because people were moving seeds with them and dropping them as they traveled up and down mountainsides. So what this did was introduce crops to areas where those crops hadn't grown before. So when we look at the cultural landscape, we've got to recognize that much of the way that we deal with it is through metaphor. Metaphor then is connected to actions, thoughts, and organizations. Foragers use marital or familial metaphors to describe human-nature relations. So the Cree of northern Canada describe hunting through sexual metaphors. Just even the Mother Earth and the opening of her womb through the hole in the ground that all life sprang forth from. That's pretty common with indigenous animist populations, right? That's a relationship to, or a metaphorical relationship, kind of relating nature to humanity. So this metaphor of Mother Nature originated with the Greek goddess Gaia. It actually didn't originate with the Greek goddess Gaia. It was just named such through the Greek goddess Gaia because really these indigenous animist explanations for Earth's creation predate the Greeks by thousands of years at least. But anyway, it's become a popular way in North America and Europe to represent nature as maternal and nurturing. So nature takes care of us. Metaphors also offer insights into a community's cultural landscape and symbolize a society's environmental values. All right, so for this third think critically, people's images and metaphors of human nature relatedness reflect and communicate attitudes towards nature and act as important guides to action. So besides natural resources and Mother Nature, can you think of any other metaphors of human nature that are related in our society? How do you think these metaphors relate to people's actual interactions with nature? Right? So explore how you define your role in nature. Explore metaphorical kinds of things. Like we think of tranquility, right? That nature is tranquil. Well, sure, that may be true while you're relaxing next to a babbling brook, probably less true if you're watching a mountain lion take down an elk, right? So and we think of animal instincts as savage. We think of being animalistic in our nature, the way that a sexual predator might stalk his prey. And yes, I'm attributing his there because most of the sexual assault that takes place is at the hand of men, not at the hand of women. It doesn't mean it's not possible for women to sexually assault. However, the statistics bear up to it, usually being male perpetrators anyway, that he's stalking his prey, right? I mean, there's a metaphor right there. So really reflect and try to think of ways that you might metaphor